So with this week's episode of The Ancient Magus' Bride, it confirmed something that I brought up a couple of weeks back, which was Elias doesn't truly understand what humans are, and that kind of ties into the whole factor of his marriage with Chisei. And I was talking about the fact that I don't think he truly understands what marriage is. A lot of the ways he was interacting and kind of bringing up the topic of honeymoons and marriages, it just felt like he didn't truly know what he was doing and how his relationship truly was being perceived by the general public. And that also was just him trying to do some sort of like experiment in the sense of trying to understand humans by using Chisei as that test subject. He 100% admits within this episode, which isn't surprising. I didn't think it was a crazy theory or just pulling out of thin air, so I really did like how he admits to everything, and even when Chisei asks, when am I going to die, he says, in 3 years if we didn't do anything, but he immediately also says, and don't worry about that because I'm not going to let that happen. I have a plan and we'll stop that from happening because her body won't be able to handle everything that she's going through with all the magic going through it. And I thought that was just very interesting because he's very honest with it. Of course, he did hide the information from her, but like he said, he had no reason to tell her because he wasn't going to let her die anyway. And what's really interesting is how the episode progresses past that. It's very clear since last week, she now has a purpose to live. She no longer is suicidal like she once was. She's no longer starting to feel very depressed and like she's worthless. She's found somewhere to call home, and like last week, she's not going to let anyone tell her otherwise. Unless he abandons her, she's going to stay by his side. And what's very interesting is the observation that Chisei will make on Elias, like the fact that even though his face doesn't move when he talks, in his eyes she can kind of notice like the difference in how he's like acting and speaking, and how it almost seems like a child in a lot of ways. Like for him living as long as he has, it does feel like he is a child, but he's that child trying to raise basically a human as a sort of test subject. It's just a very interesting relationship, and I just find that to be very unique overall. But I love the stuff when we get to introduce to the Queen of the Fairies as well as the King of the Fairies. I wasn't a huge fan of the King of the Fairies. I thought he was a little too wild for my liking, but the Queen of the Fairies I found to be a very interesting character, and I found it very amusing when the concept of babies got brought up, presenting Chisei as his wife. So of course the topic of are you going to have kids is going to pop up. And both Chisei and Elias immediately get flustered. And I actually found like Elias's chibi form to be very cute and funny when he was embarrassed, because it was like, of course, he's not actually understanding the entire situation. Like, this is supposedly going to be his wife, so he's never even thought about kids because he's not looking at her in that way. But after that, I like how he gets this feeling in his gut, which is that feeling you get when you're starting to feel in love and you're like, what the hell is this feeling? Why am I feeling this after this random question that means nothing to me? So I like the fact that even though he's misunderstood about his situation, and even though he got her just as more or less a test subject to understand humans, it's very interesting how the two's relationship is being kind of intertwined and how they truly are going to fall in love with one another. And you can already see the building blocks starting in this episode, even Chisei being embarrassed. And I just like that because even though, of course, they're not going to have babies, they're not actually going to get married anytime soon, but you can tell they are starting to have some sort of affection, and just how the episode progresses, it's very romantic, to be 100% honest, because even though the two are completely different, he's not even a true fairy or spirit, he says that in the episode, it doesn't matter because love can transcend past all that kind of barriers. I find that to be interesting. I mean, the weird thing that people keep bringing up is like, okay, but say they do fall in love, how are they gonna truly have kids? I mean, he doesn't look like he's human, how's that gonna work? These people don't understand that we're in a world of magic. Teleport a baby into her if you really wanted to, I can guarantee you. But that's just people trying to dig for details that we don't really need to see. But I found this to be a very interesting episode. I saw a comment on Crunchyroll where it was basically just saying like, this doesn't even feel like an anime, it feels like a fantasy book, it's just so magical and immersive, and I completely agree. This is such an interesting series because even though a lot of these elements we've seen in other series and other mediums, the way The Ancient Magus' Bride is kind of blending them and executing this format is some of the best I've seen in fantasy, and I just love it because it can have the darker tones, it can have the lighter tones, it can have the romance elements, the comedy elements. It feels like a series that truly could do anything it wanted to, and I think it would succeed. Like, it could have a horror episode, it could have a sci-fi episode in its own way. Like, I just feel like this is a series that it knows how to execute this because it's such a magical world that anything could truly happen, and I think it would work because every time we get introduced to a new character in some way, we learn something new about the world, or we just learn something about the characters, and how they're integrated to this world is very immersive, and I love how the characters bounce off one another, and I even love it how, like, when Chisei gets a little weirded out by, like, the King of the Fairies there, like, immediately she just runs to Elias, because it doesn't matter to her. Like, Elias is the one that she trusts. He's the only one who's ever given her comfort and a home and family. Of course she's going to go to him. And it's just so many little romantic elements sprinkled. And when the two were kind of leaving, the king and the queen, like, he was saying, you guys want to make a bet of if they're going to stay together or if they're not. And the queen says, I think a better bet would be how many kids are they going to have, because she could tell exactly, like, even though her husband was just a whack job, sometimes he does something good, like bring up a question of babies, and that sparks the romantic fire. Thought that was pretty interesting. I really enjoy the two's relationship. Apparently some people find it to be creepy, which, I mean, the entire concept is very interesting to me. Even though, yes, he's hundreds of years older than her, it still is very interesting. He's kind of like bought her as sort of a test subject to understand humans, but the two are going to slowly fall in love together, and I find that to be interesting. It's not like he's holding her against her will or anything. Like, she's literally just so attached to this basically Skeletor beast of a person here because he saved her and gave her a home when no one else would, and I think that's very interesting. I love the characters, and I'm very excited to see more. I know a lot of people are waiting for the dog character. Slightly remember him, I think he was in the OVAs, but it's been a while since I watched those. But of course, new characters are always good. But there was a lot of history, a lot of reveals in this episode of just more foundations to this episode, and it was good. Like, I mean, the soundtrack can be killer. Like, when the queen was entering the forest there, the soundtrack, the track that was playing there, it was just so magical. Like, the soundtrack can be good, but it can also be drop dead amazing when it wants to. And I think this episode was one of those cases. I really enjoy this series. Of course, I come up here every week praising it, and even when like some of the production can drop in quality, it still feels just as immersive as the first episode did, and I can't wait for episode 7. But let me know your thoughts. What did you think of this very romantic episode, and how are you feeling about the two's relationship, Chisei and Elias's? Let me know your thoughts, and before I leave, smack that like button, share your support. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. So until next time, everyone, please take care and have a good one.